From tariffs to government layoffs and firings to tighter controls at the border and a major effort to end the war in Ukraine. And that's just the start. The first 2 months of the Trump presidency have been a whirlwind of executive orders and what appears to be a shift in the world order. The U.S. presidency is one of the areas that my next guest pays close attention to. Ben Gaskins is Associate Professor of Political Science at Lewis and Clark College. He has a Ph.D. from Florida State. He teaches courses in American politics, and his research includes how religion, public opinion, and other factors influence the national political landscape. Professor Gaskins, welcome back to Eye on Northwest Politics.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Well, it seems like the president is trying to consolidate power within the executive branch, especially relative to Congress and the Supreme Court. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to understand that this is part of a 50-plus year trend of presidents of both political parties trying to do that, to have more power within the executive branch, to basically win battles with Congress over the agenda, over spending, and all sorts of things. I think the issue is that President Trump and his second administration is taking that far further than we have seen even in his first administration that he tried to go, into really centralizing all power within the executive branch and the White House itself. And unlike previous administrations, Congress, in part because it is dominated by the Republican Party, they have a majority of both the House and the Senate, have not shown any willingness to really fight back against the executive branch. And the fact that we have unified government and a president who I think has single-minded commitment to put his own imprint on federal policy, to use his power as extensively as he possibly can, shows that we're kind of in, I think, a new era of presidential power in ways that we really haven't seen ever before in American history.
So this is unprecedented.
I really think it is. And the legal scholars that I'm friendly with, I hear from, are all the time trying to figure out how far this can go. I think a lot of our Constitution is really based on the notion that these different institutions of government will stand up for themselves, will stand up for their own power and authority. And this is a unique time where Congress really doesn't seem interested in doing so right now, because they don't want to cross President Trump, and the Republicans are perfectly fine with achieving some of their political goals via executive action rather than through legislation.
Let's talk tariffs now. The tariff wars, especially between the U.S. and Canada and now Europe, are causing some real economic and political uncertainty. We've seen that reflected in the stock market and consumer prices initially. What's your take on how this is playing out with the tariffs?
Well, again, this is something that Donald Trump has long campaigned on, and I think to a profound degree, a lot of Americans didn't particularly take him seriously, that tariffs in a small set of areas could be beneficial for certain industries. But these sort of blanket tariffs that seem to be coming out of nowhere, or using fairly flimsy pretexts like the scourge of fentanyl coming in across the border from Canada and Mexico as a pretext of doing wide tariffs against those countries and our allies in Europe, has really taken a lot of political actors and elements of the economy kind of off guard. And people are realizing, no, he really means that he wants to pursue tariffs and feels that tariffs is integral to his economic policy and to the change that he wants to see in the United States.
The president making an effort to end the war in Ukraine this past week, he negotiated a ceasefire. It appears, at least from observers, that he's tilting the scales in Russia's favor while also alienating our traditional allies. What does this mean for our traditional alliances?
Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting coming out of this is that there is an increase in European solidarity. I think Europe right now realizes that it can't necessarily rely on American leadership, especially in Ukraine, because the president seems to be generally taking Vladimir Putin and Russia's side on a lot of these disputes and really pushing back against the way that policy has gone for Ukraine over the Biden administration. And so we're seeing a change in how we work with our allies and the diplomacy that we have long pursued as we are shifting both our strategies, but also kind of we're not going to be funding weapons to Ukraine anymore. The effort to end the war in Ukraine seems to be mostly about appeasing Russia's demands and trying to get Ukraine to back down and to accept things that otherwise it would never willingly accept from Russia.
Could this, though, end the war earlier?
That's the big question. Right now, it seems that Vladimir Putin is potentially amenable to a 30-day ceasefire, but it all comes down to what can be actually agreed upon, and will Ukraine find it in their benefit to stop the fighting, to accept a huge loss of territory potentially, pledging not to join NATO, having special protections for Russian language and Russian citizens, and a really fairly pronounced loss of sovereignty. And that's, I think, what is up in the air right now. But it seems that President Trump is really pushing and putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine to accept those things that has long been a non-starter for the Ukrainian government.
Let's talk about the DOGE cuts, the federal job cuts by DOGE and Elon Musk. They're causing real concerns among Americans, even beyond those who have lost their jobs in the federal government. Musk and Tesla getting a lot of backlash. The president even played car salesman last week with Teslas in front of the White House in support of Musk. A new poll shows more than half of Americans now have a negative view of Musk. So how unprecedented is this relationship between the president of the United States and, in this case, the richest guy in the world?
I think that this is the relationship. This is the change that radically remakes the Trump administration #2 from Trump administration #1. In his first administration, most of his supporters, most of his advisors were, I think, really kind of reining in some of his impulses that would have maybe an effect on the stock market, that would create economic uncertainty. And right now, Elon Musk is, I think, really feeding into some of his impulses and expanding upon them in ways that are really unprecedented. We've never seen this kind of relationship between a president and an unelected advisor who has oversight, seemingly, over the entire federal government and how money is spent and, you know, the size of these departments. And we are really in uncharted territory here, both politically and in terms of policy. But in terms of politics, you're right that, you know, this represents a huge liability for President Trump, that Elon Musk is seen as very unfavorably by most Americans. And I think get the sense that this is not necessarily what they signed up for. Americans are fine with cutting waste from the federal government. They certainly see that there is fraud, waste, and abuse in federal spending and are generally supportive of belt tightening and rooting out fraud. But it seems like this has gone beyond that and raises a number of, really, profound questions for Americans about, will they get Social Security? Will they be able to contact someone in the IRS if they have a problem with their tax returns? And will government be able to provide the services that so many Americans have come to rely on? And I think those are very real questions at the moment because of all these kind of haphazard and across-the-board cuts that we are seeing to the federal government and to these federal agencies.
Got less than 30 seconds left. Do you expect that this will calm down somewhat because it seems like the president has been going full bore since he was elected and took office?
Right. It seems that that President Trump has always really cared about the stock market. He's cared about the economy. That's really what I think a lot of his voters who maybe don't like certain things about the president but trusted him to oversee the economy. As the economy and the stock market keep being threatened and the uncertainty feeds into that, I think that is something that will perhaps convince Trump to change course, or at least allow for Republicans in Congress to apply pressure to the president to try to make some changes.
Professor Ben Gaskins, thank you for being back on Eye on Northwest Politics.
Thank you.